Welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today we're talking about the rise and fall of Palo Alto startup Theranos. In his new book, Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup, investigative journalist John Kerry details how he uncovered an alleged multi-million-dollar scheme to fraud investors at the company that eventually led to the indictment, the federal indictment of CEO and COO just this last Friday. I think this came as a shock to probably a lot of people because founder Elizabeth Holmes was really considered a standout in Silicon Valley. She had gone to Stanford and she dropped out at age 19 to start her blood testing company. And a lot of people thought that the company was really going to change the healthcare industry. And she had gotten a lot of positive press and support from a lot of really powerful people in Silicon Valley, including VCs Tim Draper, Don Lucas, former Secretary of State George Shultz, and Vice President Joe Biden had toured her facility in 2015. And so I just think people were blindsided by this. And Sue, you talked to John Kerry for this article, correct?
Well, I actually was at a conference, Association of Healthcare Journalists conference in Phoenix, where he was a keynote speaker.
Oh, okay.
And he talked about his book. And so while he was talking about it, and also we had a brief conversation afterwards, and he talked about Theranos there.
So I was thinking maybe you could just explain what this alleged scheme was that he uncovered, and then tell us how he started investigating the company. Like, what was the red flag that made him investigate the company? Okay,
well, the scheme was that Elizabeth Holmes came up with this idea. You know, lots of people hate to have needles, right? They hate needles. So the idea was that you would be able to eliminate that by having a finger stick prick to draw blood, and that you could put it into this little box on this little card, looked like a credit card, and these little nanotainers, and it would get sucked up and then read out through a program and essentially tell you what your blood test results were. The idea is this could have been revolutionary, not only because it was so easy to do and you might invite more people to get their blood tests on a regular basis, but they were also going to be able to have these devices in their homes. So let's say you needed to check your blood and you were diabetic, or you had some medication, you're on some sort of psych drugs that needed to be regulated on a regular basis. You would be able to do this, and you could be tracked, and you could do it at home. So there was a lot of personal autonomy involved. But it didn't turn out to work the way as advertised. And in fact, the amount of blood that was being used was not really adequate. It was found that then they started diluting it down to try to make it be something that, so they could get more out of it, but that just made it less accurate again.
And the results were faulty in a way that sounded like they could have been actually harmful for people if doctors didn't double check or get get a separate blood test from another company to double check what was going on.
Well, yes, and that did turn out to be so. There were people who had blood draws that turned out to show high elevations or very low levels of, let's say, TSH, which is your thyroid secreting hormone, and then you're pregnant, and you have this thyroid problem to begin with, and you're on medication, and so it's supposed to be normal, and all of a sudden the test says, oh, you need much, much more. Well, that could do a lot of really bad things to you and could kill your baby. So,
Were they putting some of these machines in Walgreens and different pharmacies for people to start using? Was it at that point?
No, well, they didn't have other people using them. I believe they had them there. I'm not so sure that that they were actually using the machines there, so much as they were stacking them in there to make them look like they were using them.
And the problem wasn't that the results were faulty as much as that they tried to cover up that the results were faulty, correct?
Well, the results were definitely faulty.
Yeah.
I mean,
but they tried to cover that up.
And they tried to cover that up. And in fact, they even used some Siemens company machines that they then altered. And they rigged those in such a way so that supposedly they could use the diluted blood in those, and that was what they were getting results from. So they weren't even using their own machines. There was this really, really scary thing where there was, at one point, they contacted Novartis, which is a large pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. And so this is just sort of typical of what they would do. So they go in with their little mini lab, and they would find when they were doing their pre-testing the night before that it wasn't working. They spent all night long trying to get it to work. So by morning, it still wasn't working properly. So what did they do? They do the demonstration, and everybody thinks they're seeing this thing in real time, right? So they're looking at a computer screen, and what ends up happening is that they were actually supposedly beaming the results to their offices in Palo Alto, right? And then supposedly getting the results back. But what they were really getting was this phony, pre-recorded, result. And then this is what they're seeing. So it really looks like you're getting the result in real time, but you weren't.
Was it Kerry's, did he think that they were actually just trying to make more money, or were they actually trying to get something working, just cover it up until it got to the point where they were doing what they said they were doing, or what was kind of the motive behind this? Does he talk about that in the book?
He doesn't try to identify the motive. He just basically uncovers the entire fraud.
Okay, and I've only read a third of the book.
Yeah,
so
yeah, he just uncovers the fraud. But really, it comes down to, I think he felt that if he never got to speak to Elizabeth Holmes. He tried many, many times to interview her, and that never came about. So all he can do is really speculate and say, I think that she basically had this idea, and she was very driven to get it in place and become this wonder child, and she ended up, it just became something that she just couldn't let go of, and she couldn't fess up to.
Yeah. So
she couldn't fess up to defeat.
I think what's really striking about this story is that with all of the high-level people involved, her board of directors, she had partnered with Safeway and Walgreens, I think, to roll this out.
Right.
That it took just an individual journalist to uncover this, and just sort of like on-the-ground classic reporting techniques, like going from doctor's office to doctor's office and talking to nurses and getting a blood test himself, like all these sort of just very old school techniques.
Yeah.
And that was what sort of undid them.
That's what I was curious about. Like what made him start investigating the company? Because most of the press was positive. I mean, she's being compared to the female Steve Jobs, and you didn't have very much negative press on her. So what got him started investigating the company?
Well, I think there was a whistleblower. There was someone who had been in the company who I believe no longer worked there, who started giving information gave it actually to a blogger, and I think the blogger had already been kind of suspicious about Theranos, I think perhaps because he had also had an experience where he went there and didn't quite trust what happened. I guess it was an experience at a Walgreens. And I may be getting my stories mixed up slightly there. I know that this has come about many times in the book. There's a lot of different references to this, but essentially what happened was this whistleblower, after going to the blogger then realized they couldn't handle the story and sent it to John, and then John basically got in touch with this person by email, and they started corresponding. And the more he looked at it, the worse it got.
What was his investigation like? I mean, I imagine this was like a really insular company and very difficult to find people who would be willing to speak on the record or use names.
They were very, very scared to speak, but there were a few people who were just so outraged, and they felt very guilty about their own roles in being involved in something that was a fraud, that was not only a fraud, but a fraud that could potentially really harm people. So I think it was something where he had to gain the trust of one or two people. And even then, throughout his process, as he began to, at one point, what he did to really kind of solidify his concerns, and he basically went to doctors. And the way he found people was he went on Yelp. And he saw what reviews were like for the company. Incredible. And then, after going on Yelp, he found the name of a doctor, and he looked her up. And I don't remember. Oh, I know. I guess Yelp has a feature where he was able to email the person. Yeah. So that was the way she did respond, because she didn't use her real name on the Yelp review. And from her, I think he was able to find out also perhaps other doctors in the area, and he also was able, there was, through industry contacts, I gather he had some, he was able to find out who else was using Theranos's products and sending their patients to the labs.
And he really faced sort of the wrath of the company as he got closer and closer to uncovering this, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they even tried to get to Rupert Murdoch and get him to, because he owns the Wall Street Journal, and basically...
And wasn't he also an investor?
Yes, and he was an investor as well, and basically tried to get him to kill the story behind the editor's back. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that he just said no, he wasn't going to, he trusted whatever they were going to do in terms of their investigations. I mean, they came in at one point, they had like a 5-hour interview with the lawyers into the Wall Street Journal. They're sitting there, he's sitting there with his one lawyer and his editor, and they've got like 5 lawyers, and they're ripping him down and, just trying to really, really, intimidate him, but he didn't go for it. There were times when he felt he was being followed. There were definitely some of the whistleblowers, one of whom was Tyler Schultz, who was George Schultz's grandson, and they know that they were basically being watched by, hired detectives.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, in your article you said that when Tyler Schultz had questioned what the company was doing, by the time he had walked out in the parking lot, his mom was calling him on the phone to tell him that Elizabeth Holmes had called the family and had allegedly been making threats to the family. So it seemed like a pretty threatening environment.
Well, I mean, yeah, what he went through, and then yet ultimately he continued to agree. I mean, at one point he went silent, but then he was able to talk to John Carreyrou again. He just said, even though my lawyer tells me I shouldn't be talking to you, this is just too important. Mm-hmm. But he saw that what they were doing was wrong, and he found certain things that were problems, and he told Elizabeth Holmes about it. And basically she just blew it off. And then Sonny Balwani, who was the COO, wrote a scathing email to him, basically saying, if it wasn't that you're the grandson of George Schultz, who was one of our board members, be out of here, you're so irresponsible, so on and so forth. So at that point, he decided it was time to get out. He had made up his mind to quit. And he quit, and as he gets out into the parking lot, his phone rings. Yeah. And it's his mother, and she's hysterical, and she's saying, Elizabeth just called your grandfather and said basically you're doing, that if you insist on your vengeance, and carrying out your vendetta, basically you're going to lose. And so there were also times when he went to, his grandfather just didn't believe it. And that was the other thing, is that Elizabeth Holmes really seemed to have, according to the book, she had a real control over people in terms of, she just had this mesmerizing stare, and people just sort of went gaga and fell for it, and she was treated like a daughter, for some of these men.
So now, what has been the outcome from this investigation? I know that there's been some indictments. Why don't you tell us what's going on there?
Oh, okay. Well, in March, the SEC basically got a big civil suit going, which accused both Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani of fraud, massive fraud. And Elizabeth Holmes settled that, and I believe she was going to pay like $500,000 in fines. She agreed not to basically head a tech company or a medical company for 10 years. Mm-hmm. There were a whole slew of things that she did that she agreed to. She was going to give up her power, which eventually she did. Now it turns out that recently that she just had, I think was it early June, I believe, there are criminal charges now that have come up against her, and she could face 20 years in prison on each of, I believe, it's 9 charges. Mm-hmm. So, and this is for massive investor fraud.
So will this go to trial?
If she doesn't settle it, yeah. Mm-hmm. If she doesn't,
I think I read it was like $700 million. She allegedly defrauded investors of.
Yeah, because of this whole thing. Oh, and it's interesting. They kind of went for wire fraud is what they did. So somebody basically wires you money for your project, and then you've taken it and you deposited it and used it for nefarious purposes or just to defraud people, then that is considered wired fraud. And it's the easiest thing that they can try to have a trial on.
And that just happened Friday. She was indicted, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then what's happening at the company?
Well, my understanding is that they're down to 25 employees or less than. And
what did they have at the peak?
I think it was close to 100.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're down to about 25. They have one of their attorneys is now taken the reins of the company as the CEO. And there are some predictions that the company may shut down completely by sometime in August. Whether or not that, what the reality becomes, I don't know. So she is facing, some serious, a serious uphill battle in terms of the court and what's going to happen. And plus, there have been many, many lawsuits. I mean, I just looked in Santa Clara County Superior Court or in federal court, and you've got like Walgreens sued, and they did make a settlement with them. I don't know what the amount was, but a lot of the companies, a lot of people that they work with, and individuals, yes. There's one that sued for medical battery because apparently a blood test came out wrong, and it didn't detect that he was about to have a heart attack. He had a condition that would have given him a heart attack, and he did have a heart attack. So as a result of that, he sued. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. There's a lot of larger questions, I think, that are raised in the book. Touches on this as well about the whole culture of Silicon Valley and this whole idea of vaporware, where you can create a lot of hoopla around something, and then it doesn't turn out. Maybe you get it off the ground in a year or two, or maybe you never get it off the ground. But this is when you're talking about medical devices and biotech. You're talking about people's lives, and so that's a whole different level that can really hurt, cause a lot of harm.
Well, do you have anything else?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I guess that wraps up today's Behind the Headlines. If you liked what you heard, hit the button below. If you want to keep up on Palo Alto News, go to paloaltoonline.com or follow us on social media. Thanks a lot.